Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerill.
Rob, we're just coming off the back of our last episode where we spoke with Philippe Cornille of IEEFA. That was an interesting episode, wasn't it? To dissect the whole European industrial gas business, wasn't it?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that episode. Great recording, great to catch up with Philippe as always. Yeah.
And I guess we're continuing this episode in a similar vein. We discussed safety, of course, with Philippe, and safety is going to be a big topic of this episode, isn't it?
I think it will be, yeah. I mean, we also talked clean energies with Philippe, didn't we? So we've got that kind of both angles covered in this episode.
Yeah, ties in nicely. And I think we're going to stay on the hydrogen train for a few weeks on the podcast here. We've not fully dived into it this year on the podcast. Of course, it was a big theme last year on the 1895 podcast, but we've got a few episodes dedicated to hydrogen coming up. But we're going to start this one off, I guess, in maybe a bit of a negative light.
I fear that might be the case, Tom. Yeah. I mean, this is an interview you've done, right? So let's give it it's a bit like the net zero and economic growth interview you did a couple of episodes back. That was the first listen for me when we did the pod. So we'll do the same here. Yeah,
we'll do the same here. So recently I spoke to Suzanne Mattei. She's the Energy Policy Analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEEFA as they're better known. And this interview was off the back of a report they published earlier this year, January.
Quite a damning report, we might say.
It was quite a damning report. I mean, the title alone, the report is titled "Hydrogen Gas Does Not Belong in Your Home. Hydrogen Faces a Diminishing Future as a Heating and Cooking Fuel." That's a bold statement, and I put that to her as well.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to hearing what what kind of responses you got and how this interview played out. I think we need to listen.
Well, let's dive into it now, and then we can dissect it a little after, can't we? And I've been now joined by Suzanne Mattei of IEEFA. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me on the 1895 podcast.
Pleased to be here.
Now, let's get straight into this discussion, shall we? Earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, in fact, you released a paper titled "Hydrogen Gas Does Not Belong in Your Home." That's a very bold stance to take, it must be said. So what got you to this summary?
Well, I started looking at hydrogen probably around 2020. Everybody was talking about it. There was a lot of hype about it in media, in industry journals, all over the place. And I sort of wondered, well, hydrogen's been around for a long time and burning technology has been around for a long time. Why are we only now looking at hydrogen? And I found out there are all kinds of reasons why hydrogen would not be a first choice for heating a home. So I looked at hydrogen in vehicles. I looked at hydrogen in power plants in a number of other situations. And we had a team at IEEFA that got together and produced a report back then challenging the notion that hydrogen was going to be a big player in the energy economy. We were focused on the United States when we did this research, but other researchers from our organization and other places have also looked at the issue. So that's how it started. And then, the government started promoting hydrogen hubs. They were going to give all kinds of financial incentives to create hubs, industrial hubs around hydrogen all around the country. Even though they really had very little information on what hydrogen would actually do, how it would actually function in the economy, how it compared with other alternative ways of doing things. And one of the things that they talked about for some of these hubs was to use it in home heating. And I live in New York, and National Grid provides gas to homes, natural gas to homes in New York, natural gas being basically methane. And they were talking about how they were going to blend methane with with hydrogen and therefore reduce the carbon issue associated with home heating. So I really started to dive in at that point. They had put it in their 20-year plan. And the result was this report.
Sure. So the outcome that you've come to in saying that hydrogen gas does not belong in your homes, is this solely down to economic reasons, or is there safety issues at hand as well, perhaps?
Yes. We looked at it. I should say I was the primary author of this, but I ran it by several other people. I looked at it from a market perspective, market competitiveness issues. I looked at it from a supply perspective, and I looked at it from safety considerations and its potential for greenhouse gas reduction and its potential to cause other problems, other health problems. So, yeah, I looked at it from a number of perspectives, and everything just kind of piled on. I really didn't come across anything that made me think, oh, this is really good.
No, absolutely. And in the report, I read through it, you touch on the inefficiencies of hydrogen burning as well. So perhaps you could just explain that quickly.
Oh, yeah. It's really not a carbon solution. Primarily, that's a big reason why not. It takes about 3 times as much hydrogen to produce the amount of energy of natural gas. So that means anything you do with hydrogen, you need a lot more hydrogen to have the same impact. So that's a volume issue. That becomes a systems management issue. It becomes a gas compression issue. So I think it was actually the Environmental Defense Fund that put out a report on the fact that you have to have a lot more gas compression. Gas compression requires energy. So when you're doing your analysis of what the emissions are going to be, you have to consider how are you powering your compression pumps. So you really have to use a lot of hydrogen if you are trying to cut CO2 emissions. And when you add that to the fact that if you're using hydrogen made from natural gas, you're not really going to be cutting your carbon dioxide emissions. Hydrogen made from natural gas is not clean. It's not clean. It doesn't. In examining the model that was used by the U.S. Department of Energy to determine what their clean hydrogen standard should be, we found so many holes in that model. Ultimately, we realized that it didn't matter. There was no way they were going to be able to make it clean if it was made from natural gas. The notion that carbon capture will take care of that doesn't work. Carbon capture is very inefficient. It doesn't meet the goals that they're constantly saying that they meet. They'll say, oh, we're going to remove 94% or 95% of the gas. They're nowhere near that. They can't even do 90%. They've got real difficulties on a commercial scale. If you have a pilot project, you might get a little, oh, look, we made 94% in this itty bitty little pilot thing. But on a large scale, it doesn't work.
No, and I'm going to continue the pile on here because there's so many other challenges as well, aren't there? There's limited hydrogen availability, a lack of pipeline infrastructure, and the cost as well that will probably be passed on to the taxpayer. Oh,
yes, or the consumer. If this is heating a home, my concern there is if it's heating a home, the cost is going to come down heavily on the individual consumer, the person living there paying their utility bills. And, some people can afford higher utility bills, but a lot of people really can't. So that's definitely an issue. I want to point out that they constantly talk about how hydrogen doesn't have carbon emissions. And, that's true. When you burn hydrogen, you don't get carbon. But unless you've figured out how to burn hydrogen without any air, like in a completely anoxic environment, you are going to have a problem because, air is nitrogen and oxygen. It's actually a lot more nitrogen than oxygen. And so when you burn hydrogen, the nitrogen interacts with the hydrogen and the oxygen, and you do end up with nitrogen oxides. Now, nitrogen oxides are a pollutant. They're a respiratory irritant. Bad to be breathing in nitrogen oxides. But in particular, because hydrogen burns so hot, that's why they like to use it in certain industries, because it burns extremely hot. It releases nitrous oxide. And some people may be familiar with nitrous oxide as laughing gas. But it's not a joke. Nitrogen oxide is, the latest estimates are saying it's about 300 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And people have usually ranked greenhouse gas concern as carbon dioxide because there's so much of it, methane because there's a lot of it and it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide, and then nitrous oxide as the third chemical of concern. And we're seeing more nitrous oxides in the air, primarily because of nitrogen fertilizer used in agriculture. But if we see a big expansion of hydrogen, we're going to see more nitrous oxides from hydrogen. And the problem in particular with nitrous oxides is, a lot of methane does break down in the air. That's why the impact of methane over a 20-year period is so much more intense than the impact of methane over a 100-year period. But nitrous oxide, doesn't like to break down. It is very, very persistent, and so it's cumulative in the atmosphere. So we should not be doing things that increase nitrous oxides, and that's what would happen with a big expansion of hydrogen. So that's when they say hydrogen burns clean, that's just not true if you're living in the real world. If there's air present, it's not burning clean because it's interacting with the gases in the air and creating those pollutants.
Sure. So turning our attention to some of those green alternatives, in your report you stated that a realistic assessment of the unfavourable market forces for hydrogen should lead utilities away from such poor investments and towards enterprises such as wind, solar power and battery storage that have a much brighter and more competitive future. So what is it that makes those alternatives that much more appealing?
They require a lot less infrastructure. You have to produce the hydrogen. That's a major industrial process to create it. Then you have to transport it. In perpetuity, you have to have pipelines that are operating and moving the hydrogen through. And hydrogen is kind of hard on pipelines. And it's hard not only on the pipelines themselves, but on the connectors, the gaskets, and when you get into the home, the distribution network there. So that makes it more expensive. You kind of don't have to be near anything to do solar. I mean, the sun is everywhere, and there are some climates that are more compatible with solar, but you can do solar anywhere. Well, I guess maybe not during the long winters in Alaska. It's not so effective there, perhaps. But anyway, it's much more flexible, and it doesn't. You're not dependent on some whole supply system that, in fact, does not exist right now. I mean, we've got some hydrogen pipelines in the United States, but they're nearly all in Texas and Louisiana, and they're short little pipelines running from, a source to an industry. I mean, that's what they are. We don't have a pipeline system throughout the United States to provide hydrogen to homes. It doesn't exist, and we're not even doing much of that in our power plants. So that's just another practicality that we have to consider.
No, absolutely. This hydrogen homes and hydrogen boilers, this conversation seems to be one that we're having every year, it feels like. You say it came onto your radar in around 2021. In 2023, here in the UK, the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee stated that hydrogen is not a serious option for home heating. And then further back in 2022, a study conducted by an energy think tank in Europe said that independent evidence does not support widespread use of hydrogen for space and hot water heating, concluding in fact that policymakers are well advised to consider the existing research carefully before allocating significant public funds for hydrogen heating. So yes. I guess my question is, why are we still chasing this?
Well, if the only kind of hydrogen available were hydrogen produced by electrolysis, just, water and energy, I don't think we'd still be chasing this. I don't think that the hype would be what it is. I don't think the pressure to move forward on hydrogen would be what it is. It is what it is because you can make hydrogen from natural gas. And it has been very much a priority among oil and gas companies to promote blue hydrogen, as they call it, for that reason. It's a market for natural gas, and they're worried about the natural gas market. They know that and the oil market. They know that electric vehicles are expanding and increasing, and that's going to affect their market. They know that solar and wind are increasing, and that's going to affect their market. So they're looking for another way to market what they have. And I think they really, at some point, may even have believed that hydrogen was going to be that thing, that they were just going to convert all their natural gas pipes to hydrogen pipes and put hydrogen in all their natural gas plants and get hydrogen into all the homes. And, it's not happening like that. There's still a lot of effort to get public funds behind it. They have these projects that may never survive without a lot of public funding. I mean, most of these projects will probably have to be put on permanent financial life support from the government because they are expensive. And the more people learn about hydrogen and its risks in the home, and in the system, I think the less excited people will be about having hydrogen in their home.
Sure. And despite all of these calls, just recently, in fact, February 4th this year, as part of SGN's H105 project in Scotland, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, 300 households switched to hydrogen for cooking and heating, which was a world first project. So what would be your thoughts on that particular project?
Well, we'll see how that goes. There are little pilot projects in the United States too. I was a little surprised that they seem to be saying, we're the only one in the world, but there are other pilot projects going around in other places. But they're saying the same kinds of things that are just not accurate. The hydrogen's a clean fuel. It doesn't produce any carbon. No, it doesn't, but it does produce nitrogen oxides. It's very misleading, and I hope nothing bad happens. I hope that nobody has a problem. But hydrogen leaks. It's a very, very small. It's the smallest, right? It's the smallest substance on planet Earth. It's a very, very small molecule, and it does leak frequently. If it's mixed with natural gas, it not only leaks itself, but it helps the methane to leak, and that's a problem because hydrogen it's got a higher explosive potential than natural gas. It's got a higher leak potential. It has a higher flame temperature. When it's burning, it's almost not visible. It's not. People can't always see it when it's burning. I was talking to an occupational safety expert who was talking about how some workers would use a broom to see if there was any hydrogen burning in the room. They just sort of swing a broom around and see if it caught fire, which is not ideal. So you have to be concerned about the risks, and the risks are higher in the smaller distribution lines. In the main lines are trekking along, but then in those smaller distribution lines, they tend to be in more enclosed spaces, and it's more possible for the hydrogen to build up. So I worry about the hydrogen as it's going down local streets and into local buildings, into local homes. The risk is higher.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the hydrogen business prides itself on being a safety-first industry, so any incident could undo years and years of good work.
Well, that's right, and I'm sure they think that they're including a lot of safety factors, but I don't understand why they don't talk about that more openly as they're asking people to put their own homes into this system. Seems like they could be a little more transparent about the potential and risks, what they're doing to try to reduce those risks. But I don't see any reason to go down that route, because I do think that heat pumps are a great alternative, and they save homeowners money. You don't have to build a whole new pipe system. It's a much easier route to go, and it provides not only heat but also air conditioning. And heat pumps are becoming more and more popular, and that's another nice thing. They really are being adopted by, my sister in Olympia, Washington. She's got a heat pump. I know people who have heat pumps. Lots of people do. And they're increasing and becoming more and more popular. They're getting also technologically much stronger. They can function in really cold weather now, much better than they used to. So they're being adopted in Maine and Alaska and other cold places.
Sure, thank you for that, Susan. And we've only got a few more minutes here. So my final question to you to conclude would be, I guess, what would be your concluding thoughts, your message to the industry, and perhaps your message to those who are still considering hydrogen in homes as a viable option?
Well, for people who are considering hydrogen in their own home, they really need to get all the information. They can't just rely on what the utility is telling them and what the public relations campaign is telling them. They need to hear about what the real risks are and how that can be dealt with. I personally would not even consider it for myself or anyone that I care about. I think that it's just too risky. So my concern is to have much more transparency about what hydrogen really achieves and what it doesn't achieve. I don't see why we should be taking these risks when use of hydrogen is not going to have such a big impact on climate change. I don't see that. Hydrogen itself has climate impacts. So when I say it leaks, that's a fire hazard that I'm concerned about, explosion hazard as I'm concerned about, but it's also, putting something else out into the atmosphere that's going to cause problems because hydrogen in the atmosphere forms hydroxyl radicals, which normally hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere are chewing up methane. They help to reduce methane and also ground level ozone smog. I was thinking about getting a T-shirt that said "Save the hydroxyl radicals," but that's another impact. That's another impact. So if the leaking has an impact and the nitrous oxide has an impact, and if they're making this hydrogen from natural gas, then they have a substantial impact. Why are we taking these risks? Why do this when there are other alternatives?
Sure. Thank you for that, Suzanne. Plenty to think about, and perhaps we'll still be having the same conversation next year on the podcast. But thank you for joining me today, Suzanne. Thank you for joining the 1895 podcast.
All right. Thank you.
And thanks to Suzanne there for her time. Rob, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good interview, Tom. First of all, I think you've got a very hot potato topic there. So some of these things aren't easy to talk about. I think my overriding opinion from that is it's quite negative. This is why I wanted to see how it played out first. But your point about the report title itself, for me, that's very emotive. It's quite, it feels emotionally charged for the individual or the consumer. Hydrogen gas does not belong in your home. Why not just call the report "Hydrogen faces a diminishing future as a heating and cooking fuel"? I don't know why you need the first part of it. So it instantly feels quite emotive to me. And I guess I can only say I think some of the arguments or the points raised in that interview were also quite charged, shall we say?
Yeah, they were. It's a report that clearly a lot of different names and a lot of research has gone into. But it must be said, not much focus on the success stories. We've had trials up and down the country here in the UK testing hydrogen in homes.
Yeah, I
don't want those to get lost, do you?
No, I think... I feel this is going one way anyway, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But just on that point, I think Suzanne said the PR campaigns aren't giving enough information around these trials. I think actually I agree, they're not giving enough information, but they're not conveying the positives and the benefits. Just like this emotive report title, I think the campaigns around hydrogen heating, etc., have been very NIMBY. They've been very not in my backyard. A lot of flaws around safety and etc. Hydrogen is a molecule, a gas, a product that's been handled very successfully for well over a century, and that gets lost. There's certainly a lot of strong arguments and business cases to say it should be part of the the energy mix, the infrastructure mix, whether that's for heating or cooking or otherwise. So, I mean, I can't remember if I've talked about this before. I heard a segment on, I think it was on Radio 4 a few years ago now, the Drive Time show, and it was talking about hydrogen trials in Redcar in the UK Northeast, I believe. And the kind of vox pops you heard from the general public were, I felt ill-informed and very emotive. Like I said, it was very much, I don't want this flammable liquid that's going to blow up my home. Well, actually you need to dive into the science and the facts a bit more. There's an incredibly impeccable safety record with hydrogen, but again, it just doesn't get communicated.
And that presumably comes down to, like you say, the PR campaign. So we've held a couple of webinars in the last few years, Project Perception Change.
Yeah, perception.
Do we still need to, is there still a perception problem around hydrogen, or surely we're past that by now?
No, I don't think we are. I think there definitely is a perception problem. I think we still face that. We hear it on the pods or the webinars. You still face the Hindenburg comments and airships. This stuff is over. It's like a century ago. It's ridiculous. So I do think there's a perception problem. I do think there needs to be much more done around the safety and the efficacy of hydrogen. Just to ensure we've got a level playing field. I think that's what we're not operating from at the moment. The business case and the applications funnel is a whole nother topic.
Yeah, we don't have time to get into that today, do we? Perhaps another pod.
Yeah, maybe we'll do that on another time. But I would just say, look, for everything I've said, I'm picking over some of the flaws in the discussion as I see it. Clearly, it's hard to argue that, perhaps hydrogen isn't the answer for boilers and heaters and cooking fuel. Perhaps it's not. The evidence appears to be stacking up against that, and there are better alternatives. But really, all I'm asking for is a level playing field of the conversation.
Well, perhaps we can champion that conversation and those safety discussions here on this podcast.
I think we should. I think the next episode must be devoted to hydrogen, Tom, because it goes beyond this thorny subject, doesn't it? This is a really challenging time in hydrogen. We're seeing a lot in the news at the moment on all levels, really, project bailouts, company bailouts, all sorts of things going on. I think we might need to devote at least one episode to that.
It feels like we're covering these project struggles every week, doesn't it? So
maybe we could ask what's going wrong with hydrogen.
I think that's what we'll do that next week. We'll get back in the studio. We'll do our research this week and bring those big stories to our listeners. And that's all we've got time for this week. Rob, like we say, we'll be back next week with that episode dedicated to hydrogen. Our thanks once again to Suzanne Mattei of IEEFA for her time and insights on this podcast today. We hope we've informed our listeners. In the meantime, do be sure to like, follow and share the 1895 podcast.